Was one bachelorette night with my ex really worth losing the man who planned our entire wedding around my favorite season? How did a borrowed hoodie and a tagged photo erase 3 years of promises in a single morning? I thought the party was my last taste of freedom, but the vendor's desk where we chose our flowers became the place where every petal was returned. My name is Zarina Belrose, but everyone calls me Zari, and I am 29 years old, and I work as a junior copywriter at a mid-size advertising agency where I write taglines for products I will never buy and sit in brainstorm meetings pretending that my ideas about yogurt branding are the most important contribution in the room. I have been engaged for 3 years to Idris Tambana, who is 32 and works as a civil engineer at a municipal infrastructure firm. And he is the kind of man who designs bridges and drainage systems with the same care he uses to plan our wedding. Measuring twice, cutting once, building something meant to last a lifetime. He proposed with a sapphire ring because I once told him sapphires reminded me of the ocean at my grandmother's village. And he remembered that detail 2 years later in a jewelry store, which is exactly the kind of steady, patient devotion that made me say yes, and exactly the kind of quiet predictability that made me feel, 3 years into the engagement, like I was suffocating inside a beautiful, well-engineered box. On a Friday evening in April, I woke up at 7:15 a.m. on the third-floor landing of an apartment building that was not mine, wearing a grey hoodie that was not mine, with a ring finger that was bare because my engagement ring was sitting on a nightstand 3 flights above me in a bedroom belonging to Caspian Holt. Caspian was 31, a bartender and part-time session musician, my ex-boyfriend, and the one man I promised Idris I would never see again. The stairwell smelled of paint thinner and old carpet and the faintly sweet cologne that had transferred from Caspian's hoodie to my skin. My phone showed 7:15 a.m. My rideshare app showed the previous night's trip. Pick up from the vinyl room at 2:10 a.m. Drop off at this address at 2:22 a.m. 12 minutes between the bar and the bed. The bachelorette party was supposed to be my last night of freedom before the wedding. 6 weeks away, invitations sealed, vendors booked. The oak arbor Idris was hand-carving in our garage, still waiting for its crossbeam. The group split after midnight. Caspian's bar was 3 blocks away. 1 drink became 4, and 4 became a rideshare, and the rideshare became a morning I was now descending 3 flights of stairs to escape. I took the ring off in Caspian's bathroom at 2:30 a.m. and placed it on his nightstand beside the phone charger. I told myself I was keeping it safe. I did not go back for it because retrieving it would mean re-entering the apartment, seeing him awake, and confronting what the night had already become. I walked out into the April morning wearing his hoodie zipped to my chin, the street smelling of damp pavement and diesel from a delivery truck idling at the corner. In the rideshare home, I opened Instagram. Paloma Chen, the freelance photographer who documented the Bachelorette all night, had posted a story at 3:40 a.m., geotagged at 614 Waverly Avenue with the caption, "After Party Vibes." The story showed a blurred hallway, a closing door, and the edge of my shoe at the bottom of the frame. The geotag pinned Caspian's building address. Idris and I shared an Instagram login for our wedding planning account, which meant every tagged photo, every geotagged story appeared in the shared notifications. Paloma's story was already sitting there like a receipt I forgot to shred. I arrived at our apartment at 7:40. The door was unlocked. Idris sat on the living room couch, dressed, phone in hand. Against the wall beside the window leaned the half-finished oak arbor he had been building for the ceremony. One section brought inside to dry, the hand-carved crossbeam showing the first letter of my name in elegant script. I walked in wearing Caspian's hoodie, no ring, the cologne drifting ahead of me. Idris looked up without raising his voice. He mentioned the geotag by address, 614 Waverly, and said it matched no hotel, no bachelorette venue, and no location the group had planned. He asked whose apartment was at that address and why Paloma's 3:40 a.m. story placed me there. He asked me to open the rideshare app and show him the trip from last night, because the destination would either match the Bachelorette Hotel or 614 Waverley, and the answer would tell him what the morning had not. He said a fiancé arriving at 7:40 in someone else's hoodie with no ring, geotagged at an unknown apartment at 3:40 a.m., was a situation he could not normalise no matter how the night started. He asked me to sit down, take off the hoodie, and tell him the complete truth, because the wedding they were building depended on the next 5 minutes of honesty. I dropped my bag on the hallway bench and said the group went to a friend's place after the venue closed, that 614 Waverley was Paloma's friend's apartment, and that the hoodie belonged to a girl at the after-party who lent it because the terrace was cold. I said the ring was in my bag. I walked to the bathroom and started the shower within 15 seconds. 40 minutes later, out of the shower, hair wet, seated on the bedroom edge, Idris stood in the doorway. The hoodie sat balled in the laundry hamper. He mentioned the hamper and said the hoodie was a men's size large with a logo from a recording studio called Analog Alley, which was not something a woman at a party would own. He asked whose hoodie was in the hamper, because the size, the logo, and the cologne were details a cold terrace could not explain. He asked whether Caspian Holt lived at 614 Waverley because he remembered the address from 3 years ago. He said the ring's absence combined with the hoodie, the geotag, and the cologne had created a picture that required more than a party anecdote. He offered to drive to 614 Waverley together right now to retrieve the ring from wherever it actually was. I said driving across town was the response of a man who confused engagement with ownership, and that interrogating the brand of a borrowed hoodie was what happens when an engineer treats a marriage like a structural inspection. The oak arbor's crossbeam caught the morning light through the window. The carved Z illuminated for one moment before a cloud shifted and the letter went dark. That afternoon, I texted Caspian to leave the ring in his mailbox. He replied with a photo of the ring on his nightstand and a winking emoji. I screenshotted the exchange and deleted it. Idris, while I was in the shower, had screen-recorded Paloma's geotagged story from the shared account, capturing the address, the timestamp, and my shoe, and saved it to a folder on his desktop labelled April. His calendar now held a new entry for Monday. Blackstone Brew, 9 a.m. Sunday morning, I retrieved the ring from Caspian's mailbox while Idris walked in the park alone. I slid it onto my finger inside the elevator of Caspian's building, and the floor-to-ceiling mirror, brushed steel frame, warm overhead lighting, showed my reflection. Ring on, hoodie returned, hair pulled back, face composed. The image looked like a woman who had everything under control. I did not look long enough to register what that mirror would come to mean. The second Friday came 1 week later, and the joint credit card told a story before I could. A $47 charge at the Vinyl Room at 1:30 a.m. and a $22 ride share at 2:10 a.m. appeared on the statement, both from Bachelorette night, connecting Caspian's bar to Caspian's apartment in a 12-minute line that passed through no hotel. Monday morning at 7 o'clock, the bedroom still smelling faintly of the cologne that had worked its way from the hamper into the fabric lining. Idris mentioned both charges. He said the $47 bar tab at 1:30 and the ride share at 2:10 drew a line from the Vinyl Room to 614 Waverley that did not pass through any Bachelorette hotel. He asked why the joint credit card placed me at Caspian's bar at 1:30 a.m. and then sent a car to Caspian's apartment 40 minutes later. He asked me to name the Bachelorette hotel, the specific hotel, the room number, the name on the reservation, because Dove booked it, and the check-in system would confirm if I was ever there. He said the wedding was 9 weeks away, and a credit card trail leading from an ex-boyfriend's bar to an ex-boyfriend's apartment at 2 a.m. was a problem that could not be buried under cologne-soaked laundry. He offered to pause vendor payments for 1 week, not cancel, just pause, while they sorted this out honestly. I capped my lipstick and said, the Vinyl Room was one of 6 bars the group visited, and the tab was split across cards, and that matching timestamps to addresses was the behavior of a man who trusted technology more than the woman he proposed to. The cologne from the hamper had transferred to the bedroom air, occupying the space between us like an uninvited guest standing in the doorway. That Wednesday, my maid of honor Dove posted a Bachelorette recap carousel on Instagram. 10 photos professional quality. In photo 4, at the Vinyl Room bar, Caspian stood in the background behind my left shoulder with a drink in his hand. In photo 7, taken 30 minutes later, he was leaning toward me, his mouth near my ear, my head tilted with a laugh. Idris, scrolling the shared account during lunch, screenshotted both with timestamps and added them to the April folder. That evening on the living room couch, Idris mentioned photo 7 specifically, the lean, the proximity, the position of Caspian's mouth near my ear, and said a man who appeared in 2 of 10 Bachelorette photos was not a random background figure. He asked at what point Caspian arrived at the Vinyl Room and whether his presence was planned, because a bartender does not accidentally appear at his own bar during his ex-girlfriend's Bachelorette. He asked whether I texted or called Caspian at any point that night, because my phone records would show the contact and he would rather hear the answer from me. He said the photos were now public on Dove's page, visible to their families and their wedding guests, and anyone who saw photo 7 would draw the conclusion he already had. He suggested I call Dove, ask her to remove the 2 photos with Caspian, and then sit with him the next evening to go through the Bachelorette timeline bar by bar. I locked my phone and said men see a woman laughing near another man and immediately construct a betrayal narrative, and that a bartender at his own bar was the least suspicious thing in the world. Through the window, the streetlight cast an orange stripe across the tarp-covered arbor section, leaning against the wall, and the carved Zed on the crossbeam glowed for a second before a passing car's headlights replaced it. After his Monday meeting, Blackstone Brew, 9 a.m. Idris came home that evening and went to bed 45 minutes early without discussing the weekend or the photos. He stopped reaching for my hand during morning coffee. His phone moved from the kitchen counter to a clip on his belt at all times. I told myself his distance was a punishment tactic. At the agency Tuesday, I told 2 copywriters at my desk that The Bachelorette was legendary and Idris was being dramatic about a group bar hop. My creative director Warren passed the desk during the conversation and paused long enough to hear me say the words ex-boyfriend's bar and harmless before walking to his office without comment. Meanwhile, at her kitchen table, Dove sat with her phone. Her folder, titled Bachelorette File, now held 4 items. Paloma's geotagged story at 614. Waverley, my text reading, "Do not tell Idris about Caspian." It was nothing. The 2 recap photos with Caspian in the background, and a screenshot of my rideshare history from the planning group showing the trip from the Vinyl Room to 614, Waverley at 2:10 a.m. She stared at the screen, made tea, and sat until the tea went cold. Thursday evening, I opened the shared tablet to check wedding centerpieces. 2 browser tabs remained from a previous session. Engagement ring appraisal near me, and vendor contract cancellation clause. I stared at them for 3 seconds, closed them, and opened Pinterest. That night in bed, the phrase cancellation clause scrolled behind my eyelids, and through the open bedroom door, the tarp-covered arbor waited in the living room's half-light, like furniture draped for a departure. The rooftop bar Gilt occupied the 14th floor of a converted warehouse, with exposed brick walls, string lights, and a glass-railed terrace overlooking the city's west side. The elevator opened into a lobby with a floor-to-ceiling mirror, brushed steel frame, warm overhead light, and I checked my reflection as the doors parted. Fitted dress, engagement ring catching the glow, hair pinned, the image of a bride-to-be ascending to her celebration. Dove had organised a second Bachelorette event, a rooftop dinner for the friends who missed the first night, and I treated it as a victory lap rather than a second chance. The terrace table held champagne, name cards, a tiara, and a Polaroid camera. 6 feet away beyond a low glass partition, a birthday group occupied the adjacent section. Idris's brother Kofi was among them, his back to our table. At 9:15, I stood with my champagne glass and tapped the rim with a fork. The table quieted. I thanked Dove and the group, made a joke about the first Bachelorette being a story for the vault, and then I built toward the line I had been composing in my head since the rideshare home 3 weeks ago. I said I was marrying the most reliable man I had ever known, and then I paused and said that reliable was the word women use when exciting is not available. I said Idris was the seatbelt, and every woman needs a seatbelt, but Caspian, I smiled, Caspian was the ride. I said I chose safety over the wind, and I did not regret it, but a bride who pretends she does not remember the wind is lying to everyone at the table. I raised my glass. 2 friends laughed. Paloma filmed an 18-second clip from the end of the table. Dove's glass stayed on the surface, her smile frozen, her eyes cutting toward the partition. She did not clap. 6 feet away, Kofi heard every word through the low glass. His friend Marcus had already begun recording. 18 seconds capturing my face, the champagne, the tiara, and the words that reduced Idris to a consolation prize. Marcus sent the clip to Kofi by text. Kofi watched it once, saved it, finished his water, and left the rooftop without looking at our table. Sunday morning at 10, Idris stood near the bedroom window, dressed, the tarp-covered arbor visible through the open door. He mentioned the word seatbelt, the specific word I used to describe him in front of a table of friends within earshot of his brother, and said a seatbelt is a restraint, not a compliment. He asked why she needed an audience to compare him to Caspian, because the comparison could have stayed in the privacy of her own doubts. He asked whether I knew Kofi was on the same rooftop, 6 feet away on the other side of a glass partition, or whether I delivered the toast believing no one connected to Idris would hear it. He said a man who discovers his fiancée compared him to her ex in a public toast cannot walk into a ceremony and pretend the vows mean what they are supposed to mean. He asked me to call Kofi today and say one sincere thing to repair the image I broadcast to a rooftop of witnesses. I sat up and said every Bachelorette toast compares the groom to the past, that Dove laughed, that the seatbelt line was a compliment because seatbelts save lives, and that calling Kofi to apologize for a bride's toast was the most embarrassing request a grown man could make. A lawnmower hummed from the courtyard 3 floors below, its steady rhythm filling the pause between my refusal and whatever came next. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Idris sat on the bed's edge while I stood at the vanity. He mentioned the 18-second clip Kofi sent. Clear audio, visible face, the words Caspian was the ride, spoken with a cadence that communicated longing rather than comedy. He asked whether Caspian knew about the toast, because comparing them publicly gave Caspian a position in the engagement that a fiancé should not have to share. He asked me to watch the clip right now with him and tell him whether the expression on my face when I said Caspian's name looked like comedy or something else. He said the oak arbor in the living room had his carving of my initial, and he would not install it at a ceremony where the bride's most recent public statement about the groom was that he was the seatbelt and her ex was the ride. He offered to postpone the wedding 3 months, not cancel, postpone, to rebuild the trust that the Bachelorette and the toast had damaged. I slammed the vanity drawer and said postponing was cancelling with a polite word, and I would not let a bruised ego delay a celebration I had planned for a year. I said if he brought up the toast again, I would sleep at Dove's and let the silence teach him what absence looked like. The vanity drawer held a small velvet box containing Idris's wedding band, engraved inside with the ceremony date, and the drawer's rattle shook the box without opening it. After his Wednesday meeting, Blackstone Brew, 2:30 p.m., Idris opened the mail alone, moved his wallet to his work jacket's inner pocket, and asked over dinner whether the venue deposit came from the joint account or his personal card. I said joint. He nodded, then spent 30 minutes in the garage workshop with his laptop open to columns I could not read before closing the screen as I crossed the threshold. Thursday evening, Dove received a call from Kofi asking if she was at the table during the toast. She said yes. He asked if anyone objected. She was quiet for 5 seconds and said nobody objected because nobody knew what to say. After the call, Dove opened the Bachelorette file and added a note. Kofi has the video. Idris has seen it. The clock is running. Amara Tambana's dining room smelled of braised chicken and the cinnamon sweetness of groundnut cake cooling on the counter, and the round oak table was covered with a crocheted centerpiece and 6 ladder-back chairs beneath a glass cabinet holding the hand-beaded ceremony sash she had been sewing for the wedding. White satin with gold and green beadwork draped over a small mannequin torso beside the dessert plates. I sat across from Kofi, Idris beside his brother, Amara serving from the kitchen doorway, and I told myself the family dinners always carried an undercurrent I could not name. During dessert, Kofi slid his phone beneath the table and placed it on Idris's thigh, screen up, video cued with a single subtitle line. She said this at the Bachelorette and I was 6 feet away. Idris looked down, pressed play, and watched 18 muted seconds of me calling him a seatbelt and Caspian the ride, the subtitles clear beneath my champagne-lit face. His jaw tightened once. He locked the phone and returned it under the table. Amara, cutting cake, glanced at both brothers and asked if everything was all right. Kofi said yes. Idris excused himself to the hallway. The ceremony sash in the glass cabinet caught the dining room light. 4 months of beadwork, each bead chosen to match the palette I selected, and the gold thread glinted like something decorative draped over something fragile. In the living room at 9 o'clock that evening, back at our apartment, the tarp-covered arbor behind him, Idris mentioned the sash in Amara's cabinet and said his mother had been sewing gold thread into a garment for a ceremony whose bride publicly described the groom as a restraint device she settled for. He asked whether I regretted the engagement itself, not the toast, not the night, but the decision to say yes 3 years ago. Because the pattern of the last month suggested a woman who agreed to a wedding and then spent the weeks before it performing nostalgia for the man she did not choose. He asked me to explain what happened between the vinyl room at 1:30 a.m. and Caspian's stairwell at 7:15 a.m., 5 hours and 45 minutes that no version of my story had accounted for, and that the geotag, the rideshare, the hoodie, and the missing ring filled with an answer I had not yet spoken. He said the sash, the arbor, the deposits, and the invitations represented hundreds of hours he invested because he believed the engagement was mutual. He suggested cancelling the next vendor meeting and using the time for a private session with a counselor, someone neutral, and said if the conversation revealed the engagement could be saved, he would recommit fully. My eyes filled with practiced tears. I said I had been carrying the guilt of one bad night for weeks, and Idris had done nothing but collect evidence instead of offering forgiveness. I said the toast was a joke I instantly regretted. I said I ran into Caspian at the vinyl room. The group happened to go to his bar, and I had 1 drink with him and left within an hour. And the rest of the night was at the Bachelorette Hotel with Dove and the girls. I said cancelling the vendor meeting was Idris giving up before the marriage even started. What I did not say was that admitting I was at the vinyl room with Caspian, a fact I denied for 3 weeks, connected the bar tab to the rideshare to the apartment to the stairwell in a chain my partial truth could not break. My 1 drink and left within an hour collapsed under the $47 tab, the 2:10 a.m. rideshare to 614 Waverley, the 3:40 a.m. geotag, and the 7:15 a.m. departure wearing his hoodie. Every element of the controlled bargain gave Idris the connective tissue the evidence needed. Monday afternoon, Dove contacted Idris through Kofi. She said she had been carrying information since the Bachelorette that she could no longer hold. Idris called her that evening while I was at a co-worker's birthday drinks. Dove sent 4 items. Paloma's geotagged story at 614, Waverley, my do not tell Idris about Caspian text, the rideshare receipt from the vinyl room to 614 Waverley at 2:10 a.m., and the 18-second toast video. She also gave a verbal timeline. The group arrived at Guilt at 8 p.m., moved to the vinyl room at 11:30 because I suggested it. Caspian was behind the bar. I stayed after the group left at 1 a.m., and Dove watched me get into a rideshare alone at 2:10 heading toward Waverley, not the hotel. Dove said she organised the Bachelorette, she was the maid of honour, and she failed both of them by staying silent for 3 weeks. Idris thanked her. Wednesday at 10 p.m., I stood in the garage workshop doorway. Idris sat at the bench, the tarp-covered arbour in the corner, a box of hand-addressed wedding invitation envelopes on the shelf beside a jar of wood stain. He mentioned the invitation envelopes and said each one had a name, and every person whose name was on an envelope would eventually hear some version of what happened. And the question was whether they heard my version or the evidence's version. He asked me to look at the arbour and tell him honestly whether the woman who slept at Caspian's apartment and toasted him as the ride was the same woman who would stand under that arbour and say vows. He asked why, if I left the vinyl room within an hour of seeing Caspian, the rideshare at 2:10 went to 6:14 Waverley instead of the hotel, because the hotel was east and Waverley was west, and rideshare apps do not drive in the wrong direction by accident. He said conversations had failed 5 times and the next step would be handled through proper channels. I said the rideshare went to Waverley because Paloma lives on Waverley, a lie I invented standing in the doorway, and that I stayed at Paloma's, not Caspian's. I turned to leave, and Idris did not call after me. The wood stain jar sat open on the bench, its sharp chemical smell mixing with the garage's concrete dust. Thursday morning at 6:10, Idris removed a slim, dark grey document sleeve from the workbench drawer. He placed inside it the USB drive with Paloma's geotagged screen recording, a printout of the joint credit card charges, and a sticky note reading Bloom and Bauer Thursday. He zipped it closed and put it in his work bag. He made 1 cup of coffee and left it on the counter. He did not make a second. When I came downstairs at 7 o'clock, the single mug sat alone on the counter, and the empty space beside it held a measurement I did not yet understand. The first morning in 3 years, he had not poured for 2. Tuesday evening, my mother Sylvain called. Dove had contacted her through the wedding planning group chat and shared the geotagged story and the do not tell Idris text. Sylvain asked one question. Did I spend the Bachelorette night at Caspian's apartment? I said I went to Paloma's on Waverley. Sylvain was silent for 7 seconds and said Dove was clear about the building number, that 614 Waverley was Caspian's address, and that a mother who sold real estate for 20 years could verify an address in 30 seconds. She said she loved me, but would not stand at the ceremony watching vows exchanged over a timeline 3 people could disprove. The call ended, and I sat on the bedroom edge, the ring catching the lamp, the sash being beaded in Amara's cabinet, the arbour under its tarp, the invitations sealed, and I told myself the wedding was still happening because I was still wearing the ring. Monday evening at 9, the apartment quiet, Idris sat on the bedroom edge in his work clothes while I removed earrings at the vanity. He mentioned my weekend Instagram story, a cafe latte with my ring hand, captioned, "Wedding countdown, 6 weeks," and said announcing 6 weeks to a wedding whose foundation he had been questioning for a month was a public performance the private reality could not support. He asked whether I had told anyone the same version of events from the controlled bargain, that I ran into Caspian, had 1 drink, left within an hour, because the versions circulating among my contacts included none of the rideshare, the geotag, the hoodie, or the 14 hours the ring spent on Caspian's nightstand. He asked me to name 1 person outside this apartment who had heard the full timeline, bar to rideshare to apartment to stairwell to hoodie, because if nobody had, the only complete account existed in the evidence he had been collecting. He offered 1 final path, a single counselling session this week where they would review the full timeline together, and if my version survived, he would recommit without reservation. I placed the earring on the vanity beside a wedding invitation sample. Cream stock, gold embossing, both our names. And said a man who built a case file during an engagement was not a fiancé, but a detective who proposed by accident. The overhead light caught the earring, a tiny gold stud throwing a needlepoint shadow across the invitation. Tuesday at 7:30 p.m., I sat in my sister Fleur's living room. Second-hand furniture, social work textbooks on the shelf, a corkboard pinned with class notes, and a photo of us at my engagement party. I had a glass of wine and the urgency of a woman building a defense before the verdict. I told Fleur that Idris had become obsessive since the Bachelorette, screenshotting stories, tracking credit charges, interrogating me about a hoodie, building a file in a zippered sleeve. I said Kofi poisoned Idris with gossip, that Dove broke the maid of honor code, that Amara never accepted me. I did not mention the ring on the nightstand, the ride share to 614 Waverley, the hoodie, the cologne, the do not tell Idris text, the 7:15 a.m. stairwell departure, or the toast comparing Idris to a seatbelt. Fleur listened. She nodded. Then she asked whether I slept at Caspian's apartment the night of the Bachelorette. My pause lasted half a second, enough for a social work student trained to read hesitation. I said I went to Paloma's apartment on Waverley. Fleur said Dove told their mother the building was 614 Waverley, Caspian's address, and asked whether Paloma also lived at 614 Waverley, or whether there were two apartments on the same block I happened to visit at 3:40 a.m. I said she was being manipulated by people who did not want the wedding to happen. Fleur did not argue. She did not agree. The engagement party photo on the corkboard, both of us with our arms around each other, Idris behind us with a champagne glass, caught the floor lamp's glow, and the distance between that image and this conversation measured something neither of us could name. After I left, Fleur called Sylvain and said the story did not hold. Friday afternoon, Sylvain waited in her kitchen, white subway tile, copper pendant lamp, dried lavender in a vase on the windowsill. When I arrived to drop off wedding favour boxes, she told me to sit. She lined up everything she knew: the geotagged story, the do not tell Idris text, the credit card trail, the toast video, and Dove's timeline confirming I got into a rideshare toward Waverley alone at 2:10 a.m. She said a story that requires 5 different people to be wrong is not a story but scaffolding. And scaffolding is for construction sites, not marriages. She said she loved me but would not stand in a pew while her daughter exchanged vows over a foundation this compromised. I cried and said my own mother was choosing Idris's family over mine. She said she was choosing the address on the geotag because 614 Waverley did not care whose family it belonged to. The dried lavender released a faint dusty sweetness that neither of us acknowledged. Friday night at 10:15, the garage workshop, Idris at the bench, the arbour uncovered now in the corner, the dark grey document sleeve beside the wood-stained jar. He mentioned that someone who had always been on my side called him today with concerns and said when a person's own sister questions the timeline has collapsed. He asked me to sit beside the arbour he built for our ceremony and tell him the complete truth, every hour from the first bar to the stairwell at 7:15 a.m. He asked me to look at the document sleeve and say whether its contents would support my version or dismantle it. He said words had been exhausted and the next step would not be a conversation but an appointment. I said men who built arbours and zippered sleeves and sat in garages like architects of their own suffering confused devotion with control. I walked inside and closed the door between the kitchen and the garage with a firmness that sounded like a gavel I had brought down on my own case. Idris unzipped the sleeve, added the highlighted credit card statement, and wrote a date on a sticky note. Thursday, 4:15 p.m., the Bloom and Bower appointment. He pressed the note to the cover and turned off the light. The fluorescent tube flickered once before the room went dark, the covered arbour the last shape visible. After his Friday meeting, Blackstone Brew, 7:45 a.m. Idris returned in a pressed shirt and dark trousers, carrying a new envelope from a P.O. box. He placed it in the document sleeve, zipped everything tight, and set it by the front door. He made a single cup of coffee and drank it standing at the window. His calendar showed Bloom and Bauer 4:15 p.m. Contract review. Below, visible only when expanded. Bring all materials. Wednesday evening, I found one browser tab on the shared tablet. Vendor deposit refund policy. Event cancellation before 30 days. I closed it and told myself engineers read cancellation clauses reflexively. Thursday morning, Idris asked me to meet him at Bloom and Bauer at 4:15 for a contract review, saying both signatures might be needed. I agreed, thinking it was logistics. His work bag sat by the front door, heavier than usual, the document sleeve inside, the car already facing the street. Bloom and Bauer was a converted greenhouse on the outskirts of the city. Glass walls, wrought iron arches, the scent of fresh peonies and damp soil from the attached nursery. The consultation room was a small glass-walled office beside the main hall, with a round table, 4 chairs, and a desktop screen showing the booking calendar. The coordinator, Renata, sat with a folder open. Idris was already seated, the document sleeve unzipped on the table, its contents arranged, the USB drive, the credit card printout, the padded envelope, and a 1-page cancellation form with his signature at the bottom. I walked through the greenhouse aisle past the peony arrangements and the sample arch where we took engagement photos 6 months ago, and I entered the consultation room expecting to discuss centerpiece upgrades. Renata greeted me and said she understood this was a difficult situation. Idris said calmly that he had requested a formal cancellation of the venue booking, the vendor coordination chain, and the deposit refund, effective immediately. He said the cancellation paperwork would also be shared with the florist, the caterer, the DJ, and the photographer, all connected through Bloom and Bauer's vendor network, within 48 hours. Renata confirmed the cancellation was signed and processed, and the deposit refund minus the retention fee would return to the account within 14 business days. On her screen, our wedding date shifted from confirmed blue to open white. I told Renata there had been a misunderstanding, that the groom was making an emotional decision. Renata said the cancellation had been formally requested, and she could not override a signed form without both parties' consent. A couple at the adjacent tasting table, sampling cake for their own wedding, paused with forks in the air. I believed that testing my freedom before marriage was what every honest bride owed herself, that removing the ring was safekeeping, that the toast was confidence, and that the hoodie was borrowed warmth. But the ring on the nightstand was not safekeeping. It was a deposit left at a counter I planned to revisit. The geotag was the coordinate of a night that existed, whether anyone photographed it or not. The toast was a ranking delivered to witnesses whose phones became evidence. And the man I called a seatbelt, the one who carved my initial into oak across 11 patient weekends, turned the documents I dismissed into a vendor cancellation chain that moved faster than any version of the story I could revise. Closure snapshot. The key exchange happens Sunday at noon in the apartment lobby. I carry a canvas bag with bathroom items and a potted succulent from the bedroom windowsill. Idris stands near the mailboxes in a plain t-shirt, holding a labelled envelope with the spare key and the building fob. Through the lobby's glass door, the April sun falls across the tile floor in long white bands. In the garage behind the building, the oak arbor leans against the workshop wall uncovered now, the tarp removed, the wood oiled and sealed, the carved Z on the crossbeam still visible but sanded slightly at the edges, as if the letter has been reconsidered but not erased. He hands me the envelope. I hand him the key. The lobby door opens as a neighbour enters carrying groceries, and the gust of spring air that sweeps through smells of cut grass and pollen, and the particular sharpness of a season that was supposed to hold a wedding, but instead holds only the distance between two people standing 3 feet apart with nothing left to exchange.